Now we're going to say, okay, now I have to sort the bills to see which ones I want to pay. Where do I do that? In what used to be called the vendor center. Now it's the expenses area. And then I'm going to close the hamburger. So in the first tab, I can sort for typically the bills. So these are all the transactions, but I want specifically the bills, right? I want to look at the bills and then look for the ones that have not been paid. And I can sort here by the items that haven't been paid. Here's the Verizon bill. Of course, normally I would typically want to sort by the due date, right? The due date over here. But I could also more likely go to the bills tab because that specifically relates to the bills. And I've got my 3 tabs up top. I want to go into the unpaid items. And then once again, I can filter this. I'm going to look at all the vendors typically, unless I want to sort by a particular vendor. Typically, we're going to look at basically all the vendors and then maybe have a date range change here. And then here's all the information on the unpaid bills. By definition, they're not paid because they're in the unpaid tab. So this is most likely where we would go to pay the bills and sort them out and decide which ones we want to pay. But we could also go to the vendors tab and look by vendor for the bills that haven't been paid with our items up top. So this would most likely be where we would go if a particular vendor asked us a question. So in this case, we're not going to go to the bills typically. I'm going to say, well, let me go to your account specifically to see that particular bill. We'll go to the open bills in this case. So now it's sorting all the vendors that have open bills within them. We can go into the Verizon item. And so there we have it. So there's our bill. And once again, I can schedule a payment here. Or mark as paid if it had already been paid. And I can go into that bill if I needed to get more information on it, seeing the account that we posted to, as well as the due date and so on and so forth. And if I attached something to it, like the actual bill that we received, then I would have that attachment down here as well. Let's close that back out because the most likely place we would go to pay the bill is in this bills area. And this is where, if we're in the accounts payable department, where this might be all we do, is basically enter the bills and then try to sort them and pay them as late as possible, holding on to our cash as long as possible due to the time value of money and wanting to maximize our cash flow. So then we can sort these and say, let's sort it by, here's the status that it's going to be past due that we have, and then here's the due date. So notice it's sorted by, in essence, due date. I can click here and it'll resort. So I can sort by any of these that I want to. But typically you would think that we'd want to sort it, in essence, by due date and have the ones up top, the oldest ones that are due. Not the oldest ones in terms of when we entered them, but in terms of the due date, when they're going to be due. On the right-hand side, we have the schedule a payment, noting that that's a little bit different than the pay bills form, which we can find up top in this bills area. Also can be found under the plus button, which if this hamburger is closed, you'll note that this plus button is currently right here, and then under vendors and pay bills. But this plus button is one of the things that kind of gets moved around when they change the website. So typically you can always find it if you open up the hamburger, whatever they call this button, it'll typically be here. And then under vendors, you got the pay bills. So what's the difference between the pay bills form and this schedule a payment? So let's go into that. I'm going to close up the hamburger and let's say I go into a schedule of a payment. That takes me, in essence, into a sales page by Intuit. Intuit being the owner of QuickBooks, basically saying, hey, we might be able to integrate the process, allowing you to automatically schedule the payments and then possibly make the payments automatically with an electronic transfer, which sounds like a bank feed, right? So you might say, well, what's the difference between that and bank feeds? Am I just signing up to bank feeds here? And it might be a little bit different because when we think about bank feeds, we think about our bank that we chose, the financial institution, not being run by QuickBooks. It's not like a QuickBooks or Intuit financial institution. It's its own institution that we're then importing the data from with a connection, allowing the increases and decreases to the checking accounts into our system so that we can use that to help us with our bookkeeping. Whereas we could have a situation where the bank itself is kind of owned by Intuit, the owner of QuickBooks, allowing possibly a little bit more integration for us to schedule the payments within the system and then actually make those payments at the scheduled date. Notice that's a little bit higher of an integration, meaning usually when we have the bank feeds, I don't schedule the payment within QuickBooks in order to make the payment automatically. However, I might be able to schedule the payments with the financial institution and my vendor. In other words, if I'm paying the phone bill, I might be able to say when the phone bill comes to me, I want to electronically make the payment directly out of my checking account automatically, and just make that an automatic payment on the third-party vendor website and my bank. And then it'll come through to my system using the bank feeds, at which point I can record it, right? But here we're saying I'm gonna enter it as a bill and then schedule the payment, which might give me a little bit more leeway to schedule the payment as late as possible according to what's on the bill, and then use the system internally within QuickBooks to make the payment based on the bill payment date, right? That's a little bit different of an integration, and you might need like a QuickBooks bank account or something to set that up. So you can look into setting that up if you wanted to add that added level of integration. Otherwise, you can sort your information here, and then you're typically going to go into the pay bills form, which once again you can find here, which will give you this window. Looks like this. You have a similar kind of layout, similar kind of filters you have up top. You can also find it if I close this out. You can go in there directly once again with the hamburger, the plus button under vendors,